Welcome to another Workforce Education webcast presented by the National Dissemination Center for Career and Technical Education. I'm Morgan Lewis. Our topic today is math in career and technical education. The main message of the last 2 decades of educational reform is that we have to expect higher performance from all of our students, including those in career and technical education. And the academic area in which most students have the most problems is mathematics. For the past 2 years, the National Research Center at the University of Minnesota has been conducting a study that has enhanced the math instruction in traditional career and technical education curricula. Here to tell us about that study today is Dr. James Stone, Director of the National Research Center. Before I turn the lectern over to Dr. Stone, however, I would like to invite all of you who are watching this webcast live to submit questions to the chat room that accompanies the webcast. If you are watching an archived copy of this webcast, the chat room is not available. Jim?
Thank you, Morgan, and hello. I'm quite pleased to be here today to talk to you about a study that has consumed about 2 years of my life and my colleagues' life. Morgan has been an active participant, along with more than 200 teachers across the country and others who've been involved in this study. I also always need to begin these conversations with a disclaimer. We are funded through the U.S. Department of Education. However, the contents, as the slide says, do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the Office of Vocational and Adult Education or the U.S. Department of Education, and therefore you should not assume any endorsement by the federal government. This team I mentioned of more than 200 teachers was supplemented by folks who worked directly with these teachers to actually implement the study. We had folks from Penn State University, the Ohio State University, from the community college system in Colorado, from the public school system in Michigan, Oklahoma State University, and of course the University of Minnesota. These are the folks that actually did all the hard work. I get the pleasure of talking about it. Let me put this in context and begin by talking a little bit about what we think we know about career and technical education in the United States. There's a fair amount of evidence that has been brought to the fore, the NAEV, for example, in recent reports by the National Center on Educational Statistics, that point out that kids who are identified as CTE majors or concentrators in high school do in fact continue their education beyond high school. We also know that math and science course taking has increased not only in aggregate amounts, but also in the type and complexity, more algebra 2, more geometry, being taken by those students who are identified as majors. We also have an abundance of evidence, although there's some controversy, about the extent to which career technical education actually keeps young people in school. This, of course, is a major consideration. Current estimates are that about 68% of kids who start 9th grade do not successfully complete high school within 4 years. And conversations, therefore, about achievement and transition are somewhat moot for that 32% who, in fact, do not complete high school. So this is an important consideration. And if, in fact, career technical education keeps young kids showing up the next day, then this is something that certainly deserves attention. There's also an abundance of evidence that young people who major in career and technical education, in fact, enjoy economic returns to that investment, but also those economic returns come back to the communities. And finally, there's evidence that young people who double major, who follow both the college prep curriculum, if you will, along with a concentration in career tech ed, do pretty well in things that occur after high school in terms of transition both to continuing education and to the labor market. So one could conclude that a decade of reform targeted at career and technical education, along with the actions of states across the country, have begun to have an impact. But in fact, the conversation is about achievement and transition, and these are the challenges that we face. One of the ways to think about career and technical education in the context of improving the high school experiences for young people is to recognize first that career and technical education is a program. And in that, there are 3 pedagogic opportunities for teachers to increase the learning of young people who participate. There is the traditional classroom experience, which may look very much like a regular classroom, or it may take place in a shop or in a lab. There's also the work-based learning component, and there was a fair amount of research that was targeted at this part of the experience during the 1990s. And so we know a fair amount about that. And there's also the learning that can occur through student organizations, or CTSOs. And we at the Center have just completed a study, that report of which will be out shortly, on career and technical student organizations. And then, of course, there is the preparation of the teachers, pre and in service, to prepare them to be effective in the classroom with work-based learning and with student organizations. But we can also think about career and technical education as a structural strategy, really in two ways. There is, of course, now more than a decade of experience with tech prep, dual credit, articulated credits. Career magnets are a structural response to organizing schools, as are regional centers that provide opportunities for young people. But career and technical education structurally can also be the focus of school reform. One of the most interesting areas, and one that's growing quite rapidly across the country, is the use of career academies. Whether they be small learning communities or career academies, they often share the same characteristics. And it's a way of using occupations in the workplace as a focus for reforming and improving the education for all young people. Career pathways is another opportunity. Middle college, high schools is yet another opportunity. So if we think about career and technical education, we can think about improving the classroom instruction, we can think about improving the work-based learning instruction, we can think about using career and technical education as a structural mechanism for improving education and improving the outcomes of education. But what I want to focus on right now is really the aspect of career and technical or the aspect of the high school experience that is getting an awful lot of attention. And that is that young people are increasingly required to take more traditional academic coursework to graduate from high school. In the early 1980s, it took about 22 Carnegie units to exit high school. That figure is now about 26. That increase of 4 academic credits has been almost exclusively in math and science coursework. We find many states now that require 4 years of math. Many others require at least 3, and almost all require at least 2. But what has that increase in math course and science course taking brought us? At least in terms of what the National Assessment for Educational Progress measures, it doesn't seem to have brought us very much. In 1973, the average score on the NAEP test was about 304 points on the math part of it, out of a possible 500. In the year 2004, that figure was about 307. In fact, not much change over more than 30 years of increasing math course requirements to graduate from high school. In fact, in their report, entitled The Nation's Report Card, the USDE noted that the number of 17-year-olds who are taking calculus has increased, nearly 17%. Over half of the young people are taking Algebra 2. They themselves note that it's unclear why this trend in increasing math course taking and increasing the complexity and the level of math course taking hasn't translated into an increase in math performance. So that's the problem on one side. Then we think about why focus on career and technical education. Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, we know that virtually every young person in the high school today takes at least one course in career and technical education. We know that a substantial proportion of young people take a lot of coursework in career and tech ed, especially during their junior and senior year, in what we call specific labor market prep. And according to the NAEV, about 1/4 of all kids are concentrators. And these are young people who take 3 or more credits in a sequence in a particular occupational area. So there are a lot of kids who take career tech ed, and a lot of kids invest in it fairly heavily during the course of their junior and senior year. And if we drill down a little bit and look at some of those students, another thing that we find is that a lot of kids who invest heavily in career tech ed bring with them characteristics that are associated with not performing well academically in high school. So, for example, kids who are in poor communities, the bar on the far right of your screen there, that turquoise-colored bar, kids who are in poor communities where more than half of the young people are on free and reduced lunch, more than 70% of those kids enroll in 3 or more SLMP courses during their high school experience. Again, principally in their junior and senior year. Kids who come into high school with lower academic ability, grade point averages of less than 2.0, almost 76% of them invest heavily in career tech ed during the course of their high school experience. Kids with disabilities, kids with limited English proficiency, kids out of particular minority communities. These are all kids about whom closing the achievement gap is an important and ongoing conversation. And we have them in career and technical education. So if this were a detective show, we would talk about motive, we would talk about opportunity, and we certainly have both here. Finally, we think that it was interesting to think about focusing on career and technical education because we know that the curriculum is rich in math context. That is because the curriculum in career and technical education is derived from occupations. And we know that every occupation, every occupational arena, has as a basis math, science, and technology. Whether you're a cosmetologist or an attorney or an auto mechanic or a business manager, there is mathematics, there is science, and there is technology that is part of what it takes to be successful in that occupation. However, we also know that traditional curricula and traditional pedagogic strategies that CTE teachers are taught are not designed to enhance or to sort of pull out and really deal with the mathematics that undergirds the curriculum. So we have the opportunity, the math is there, but historically and more traditionally we have not taken advantage of it. We have tried some things over the years and are still doing some of these. There are things that we have called related math classes. Typically business math would be an example. During the 1990s with the School to Work Opportunities Act, there was an emphasis on applied math, also through the Tech Prep gave some push to that notion. And applied math enjoyed a brief period in the sun, if you will, until many people realized that institutions of higher education did not recognize it as math. It didn't say algebra, it didn't say geometry. So we don't see as much of that as we once did. And then there are these pull-out math classes that occur with, often in regional centers, where a math teacher might come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or in the vocational schools, and work with students. So they'll literally pull the kids out of class and work with them, working with them on math. And then there are team teaching opportunities where math teachers come into the career tech ed classrooms and work with the students. Now I've got an asterisk by these because these may in fact provide some value, may actually affect math achievement. However, we don't know. And we don't know because none of these have been subjected to the kinds of rigorous studies that we have employed in what we have come to call our math and CTE model. And what I'll be telling you about here and what you'll be having teachers share with you their experiences with is a research-based model that really drew on what we think we know about contextual learning, what we think we know about the notion of transfer of learning, and what we think we know about this notion of integration. What we decided to do was design a very simple study, and the study was designed to test the idea that we could work with career and tech ed teachers, people like you, who are not math instructors, who are not trained to be math teachers, but to help them understand the math that's embedded, naturally occurring, if you will, in their curriculum, and help them access it so that they in turn can help their students access it and understand it and learn it in ways that help them solve workplace problems, but also help them understand that same mathematics in other new or in novel settings, such as a paper and pencil test that one might have to take on a college entrance exam. But we wanted to see if we could do this without having the negative impact of reducing that which makes career and technical education interesting and valuable to the students, the content or the technical skill development. We asked 4 questions at the start of this study. The first question is whether or not by doing something with the curriculum, doing something with the pedagogies, in fact we could increase the math understanding of students in these classes where the learning is enhanced, where the math is enhanced. That was the first question. But as many of you know, it's possible, especially with the sample size that we had in this study, to have a very small impact on test scores, if you will, but overall not be very meaningful. And that was really the second question. The first question is, can we make a difference? The second question is, what's the magnitude of that difference? Is it big enough to make this worth thinking about? The third question is, can we do this, and we wanted to test and measure this, can we do this again without reducing the technical skill development? And finally, we wanted to tease out what works. Now, in our study, these are just some of the key features. And the first couple, I think, are quite important in terms of making the case once the study was done. This was a random assignment study. This means that of our teachers who were part of the study, half were randomly assigned to be part of the experimental intervention, the other half were assigned to be part of the control group, which is to say, to do what they would ordinarily have done. We also wanted to make this study big enough so that when we were finished, whatever we found, we would be able to argue that it either did or did not have some generalizability to all of career and technical education. So we ran 5 simultaneous replications of essentially the same study. We also wanted to use established measures of math achievement. So we have three. One is an applied version of math, one is traditional, and one is a college placement, and I'll talk more about those in just a moment. We used a variety of methods to respond to these questions and to try to tease out what we could learn and what we could share with you. The focus, as I mentioned earlier, is on the CTE curriculum and the math that is naturally resident there. And finally, we wanted to pay attention to a model of curriculum integration or contextual learning that was grounded in theory that we could look at and really build a model that, if it worked, we could share with you how to do this. We also spent a lot of time looking at something we call fidelity of treatment. And that really is the question of the extent to which the teachers actually did what we asked them to do. And for those of you that follow this kind of literature, you know that this is one of the most difficult things to deal with in education reform, is consistency in terms of whatever the treatment may be each time that it's replicated. One of the conversations that we began with at the start of our study was we wanted to emphasize higher level math. Now, typically people think of geometry and algebra and trigonometry and calculus and the like as higher level. But as many of you know, kids who come into our junior and senior level classes in career and technical education very often are not competent in lower level math, arithmetic, the ability to translate fractions to percentages and percentages to decimals and the like. So that in pursuing the higher level math, we also often had to deal with remediating them on math that they may have learned in 6th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade but have long since forgotten. So while we did focus on higher level math, we clearly also had to pay attention to all math. I mentioned 5 simultaneous replications. We ran our study in an Autotech design or an Autotech area. Business and marketing education was the second, IT, ag, power and transportation, and then health. And in each of those, then, we randomly assigned half of the group to be part of the experimental condition and half to be part of the control. For our full year implementation, we had around 3,000 students involved and about 130 teachers in 10 states, I believe. It's our final count on that. Now, it was set up fairly simply. In each of the experimental schools, we had an experimental teacher or a teacher who was in the experimental group and partnered that person with a math teacher. The intent was to have these teacher partnerships in the same school, but in a couple of our sites we had regional centers, so we had a math teacher who was sort of imported because they did not have a resident math teacher. But then we had the control teacher wherein, by design, in most cases, was actually in a separate school because we didn't want the teachers talking to each other over lunch breaks kind of going, oh, I'm doing this in mathematics. So we wanted to keep it as clean as we could, so the control teachers taught the same curriculum but in a different school. And then we had liaisons who helped us run the study, administer the tests, and help us collect the data in the schools. As I mentioned, we had 3 measures of math achievement. We wanted to use existing math tests for a variety of reasons. First of all, these have established reliability and validity coefficients. We don't have to argue that this is a good or bad test. The Terra Nova is published by McGraw-Hill, is used by a number of states for their exit exams and also for their high-stakes tests. AccuPlacer is a widely used college placement exam along with Compass. We chose AccuPlacer because they were first up willing to work with us in this study. And then finally we used the math portion of the WorkKeys test. Arguably, WorkKeys gives us an applied version of math. So we had a traditional math, a college placement math, and an applied math test. And then we worked with NOCTI and AYES and MarkEd to provide the appropriate content or occupational skill area test, depending on which site they were in. So again, we had the academic test and we had the occupational tests. The experiment itself consisted of 2 pieces, or 2 parts. There was the professional development as well as the pedagogy. And as I mentioned, the pedagogy itself we pulled from the literature to create a model that would allow us to enhance the transfer of learning. In terms of professional development, we first created teams, individual teams within schools in most cases of a CTE and math teacher, and then brought them together in groups around specific occupational foci. So it might be auto technology, health, business, ag, and so forth. These teams, as it turns out, of 10 to 20 teams or pairs of math and CTE teachers turned out to be a very important part of what we learned about how to make this work. But these groups began the process of professional development by curriculum mapping. Now, you'll notice as we go through this, there is nothing in here that is particularly new that someone probably hasn't done somewhere at some time. So I want to put that out there right in front. Curriculum mapping is done by a lot of folks. We actually searched as far and wide to find curriculum maps, thinking that we could just hand them out and begin with those and then move on to the other things. Well, it turns out that curriculum mapping is a very important part of the process. But this is where these groups of teachers began. And the curriculum mapping was simply identifying where the math was in these different occupational curricula. We took what we learned from that and mapped it out over the course of the year in a scope and sequence process. And then the teachers engaged in about 10 days of professional development during the course of the year. And then finally, there was a process of ongoing collaboration that we designed and implemented. As I mentioned, the curriculum maps, we looked for places where they existed, started with those in some cases, but in all cases, the teachers wound up creating their own. Now, an important part of this process that makes our approach different than some others is we began with the CTE content. There are some approaches that begin with state standards or content in algebra or geometry and try to superimpose that into or onto the CTE curriculum. That's not our model. Our model starts with the CTE curriculum. We identify the mathematics that is embedded there, and we work with that. And that's a critical piece of what we did, and we'll talk about the impact of that in just a little bit. But we created a map for the school year, we aligned it with the curriculum, and that was our scope and sequence. This is a scope and sequence for our business and marketing intervention. You'll notice that, for example, the first 3 weeks of the school year, there's no math because it's introduction, it's orientation, they're doing other kinds of things. When you move into week 4, we begin to move into math, and you'll see that we're dealing with some ratio and percentages. And then next week, we're dealing with graphing and predictions and algebraic expressions and so forth. Now, you'll notice that in this case, and in the next one I'll show you, we did connect these to state and in some cases national standards. The purpose was to show where we're intersecting with the standards, but not to have those standards drive the math that we chose to focus on in our enhancements. This is one from agriculture. So on the far left-hand side, in the yellow column, you'll see the specific kinds of activities that the students would engage in the classroom. This is the occupational content. The middle 2 columns are expressions of that state's academic standards in math, and the far right column in blue is the NCTEM standard. Again, to emphasize, we began with the left-hand side of this graphic. We began with the CTE, or occupational content, and drew from that the math, and then linked that, just for illustration, to show how we intersected with either state or national standards. This is a scope and sequence. We use this both for planning but also for monitoring. I mentioned earlier the notion of fidelity of treatment. We use this to keep in touch with our teachers about whether or not, in fact, they were teaching the math when it was planned to be taught, which is when, presumably, it was bubbling up from the curriculum. So those are just our designators. You'll see that the math cluster meeting is identified there. We did 2 or 3 of those a semester. This was an opportunity for the math and CTE teachers to get together outside the classroom and outside the school in most cases and just talk about math. One of the things to keep in mind about our approach is that we're asking non-math teachers to address math concepts. This is our design. We did not bring math teachers in to teach the math. These are CTE teachers who are addressing the math concepts. And in some cases we found we were asking teachers to address math concepts that they themselves had never experienced in a formal classroom setting. So it was important to make sure that they understood the math so that they in turn could explain it and work with their kids in their classrooms. And then we have the professional development. As I mentioned, it was scheduled throughout the year, about 10 days. We started with 5 days in the summer, 3 days in early winter, and then 2 more days in the spring. The pedagogy then is the second piece. So we have the process or the professional development, and then we have the pedagogy. This became known as our 7 elements. And again, there's nothing here that's terribly surprising. We began with introducing the CTE lesson. And one of our first lessons in introducing the lessons is you don't tell the kids, today is math. Rather, we had to find other more creative ways because guess what? Kids don't come into CTE classrooms to study math. And so we learned ways to introduce the math concepts, and you'll see some examples of this in just a little bit, that that lowered the barriers, that lowered the resistance, that lowered the apprehension, so that kids could actually begin to think of it in ways other than perhaps they thought about it before. The highlighted areas in the middle of this illustrate the notion of what I've come to call successive approximation. We start with the embedded, the example that's there. Whatever they're measuring, whatever they're actually working with, that's the most deeply rooted, truly contextual part of this model. We then would have them work with that and introduce the equations or the models or whatever was necessary. Excuse me, whatever's necessary to help them solve the problem. We would then give them an example in a similar context, but change the numbers so they could play with the formulas, with the procedures. And then finally, we would work them out to an example in a more traditional way, so that they would recognize that maybe they were building a roof on a pig barn over here, but when they saw that same problem slope on a graph out here, it was the same underlying mathematics. And then, of course, we use various forms of assessment to test for their understanding. Now, here what we'd like to do is to show you an example of, in the auto technology area. This is for some of you, this might be considered a monster truck. And here's the example the kids would actually encounter in the classroom. And as most of you know, especially a lot of us guys, like to make our cars go faster so that we can get tickets more often and more frequently. But here what they'd done, they put large tires on it. And so the problem is posed to them that the suspension system has been modified. And so the teacher will then talk them through the kinds of things that in an occupational sense they need to address. If you're going to change tire size, what other things do you need to think about? But now we know that Larry has a problem, and the teacher will have introduced this. And now what we know is that underlying the solution to the problem that comes with changing the tire size is the need to change something about how you stop that truck when you're rolling down the highway. And in understanding that, we can begin to understand them, or introduce them to Pascal's law. And so now we get into the language of mathematics and introduce that in the context of the language of the workplace. This is what we call the bridging language. We move back and forth between the language of the workplace and the language of mathematics. And it's a back and forth constantly during the course of the year. This isn't a one-time event, but constantly our teachers work with our students to reinforce that this is the workplace application of a mathematical concept. And this is Pascal's law. The students would be introduced to this. And the formulas, the procedures. How is it that one then moves from the notion of Pascal's law to an actual mathematical model that can be used to solve a workplace problem? And this is another way that it was expressed. And at this point, what I'd like to do is to introduce Morgan again, who will talk a little bit about the film clip that we'll see here.
As part of the study, we asked the teachers to give us videos of the actual classes in which they were teaching the math-enhanced lessons. This is just a small part from a clip in which Les Humphrey is introducing the lesson which Jim has just introduced to you.
Larry bought a Ford truck. The first thing Larry wants to do to the truck is raise it and put great big tires on it. That's what Larry wants to do. What parts control the braking system? Any ideas? The calipers? Your feet or the brake shoes. Not your feet if you're putting your foot on the pedal. He modified the suspension system, but he never changed the braking system. And the truck doesn't stop like it's supposed to stop. So far, we haven't talked about math at all. We're just talking about the pieces that make the brake system work. And we talked about, would we make them bigger because he made everything else bigger? Yeah, but what we're doing here is guessing. And guessing's good. We can guess at this. So yeah, we want bigger parts. Once we find out that information, we can determine how Pascal's law is going to fix this brake problem. Okay? Once we determine what the radius is, what the diameter is, what the area is, we can apply Pascal's law. So,
well, now you've seen an example of how this works in an auto shop. But can we get the same kind of thing when we turn to the human body? Well, let me share with you a little bit of information about a friend of mine named Alice. Alice has come into the emergency department, and she's managed to fall into a campfire. Poor Alice. Well, now what we have to do, though, you're a first responder. We have to be able to call ahead to the hospitals and warn them about this patient coming in. And so we have to calculate the area of burn and determine the percentage of her body that's burned. How serious is this? Is this first degree, second degree, and so forth? Well, it turns out that Alice is full of geometry. Probably full of something else, but we'll leave it at geometry for right now. So what we do is we want to break her body into geometric shapes. For example, her head's a sphere, the arms and legs are cylinders, her thorax is a rectangle, and so forth. And by the way, here's Alice. So we start with the head. Well, there's a formula for a sphere. We look at the solution. How much surface area is there? If her head were burned, how much surface area is involved? Arms are cylinders, and there are mathematical formulations to calculate that. The thorax is a rectangle, and there are mathematical formulations for that. And we can begin to understand how much of the surface area of the human body was affected by this burn.
Here's another clip from another lesson in which Ann Nodell has already taught Alice's areas, but she is now summarizing and using this summarization of the class to also reinforce medical terminology, which is essential in this class.
We've got a burn victim here. He has burns to his right chest, arm, and right leg. He's a firefighter that fell through the floor of a structure. You are to estimate the percentage of body surface area that is burned. Okay, so what side is the right side? This one or this one?
The other one. The other one.
This one.
Yeah,
okay, so his whole right arm is burned. Okay. He has a second-degree burn from mid-sternal area. Where would that be?
Middle, right here.
Okay. To mid-axillary line on his chest. Where's mid-axillary?
Armpit.
Under the armpit. So from here to here on his chest. Not his abdomen, his chest. Okay? He's also got the lateral 1/2 of his right thigh. Here's his right thigh up here. What's lateral?
Up and down.
Up. Away.
Medial, lateral.
Oh, away from.
Side to side.
The side, on the side.
Yeah.
Okay? So your lateral thigh would go from the front of your thigh to the back of your thigh. This is your lateral thigh. Okay? So from here around to the back. Okay? So it'd be back of your thigh. And this person also has 2 palm-sized burns on his right lower leg. So tell me, what percentage of his body is burned?
24.5%. So you have a 4?
Very good. That was fast.
What was it?
What's this percent?
9.
9. What's this percent?
4.
So the whole thorax is worth how much percentage?
18. Whole?
Yeah, the whole
36.
thorax. 36. Okay, so this is
9.
a very small part of it, okay? So this is like 1/8, you think?
That's a.
1, 2, 3, 4, and then 4 on the back. The answer is 9% of the arm, for the arm, 9% for the chest, 4.5% for the right thigh, and 2% for the lower leg. So if you add it all up, it's 24.5.
Yeah.
Would this patient go to the burn center?
Yeah. Yes.
Plus
Why?
it's on joints.
For sure.
Okay, and how much fluid do you think this person would get? Remember, it's 500, 250, 150. 500 cc's an hour. Okay.
Well, let's hope he survives. This is an example of how you use mathematics to solve a workplace problem. Whether you're working with the human body, which is full of geometric calculations, you're working with an automobile, or you're working to develop a business plan, there is mathematics embedded throughout these various occupational curricula. And so you were introduced briefly to our approach to pulling this math out to help the young people understand it. So then the question is, does this matter? Does this approach to helping young people access the math have any impact on measures of math ability? So I want to break this into two conversations. First, what did we find? And then from that, what did we learn? Well, the first thing that we learned, and not surprisingly, or first thing we found, was that the kind of math varies across the different occupational areas. So we had the 5 sites. You see site A through site E. The math concepts down the left-hand column are derived from standard taxonomies of math. And you'll notice, for example, that if you were in site A, you would be exposed to a lot of data analysis, statistics and probability, and algebra. You would find a lot of the statistics and probability in site B, but not as much algebra. But you would find more algebra than that in site D. In site D, you would also find a lot of computation and numerical estimation. The point is simply this. The math that's accessible varies across the different occupational curricula. This will lead us to one of our important things that we learned that I'll discuss here in a few minutes in terms of one of our core principles. But this pattern of relationships is important to understand. The kind of math, the amount of math, the level of math that's accessible varies across the different occupational arenas. What we did was a fairly straightforward design. Again, we had a random assignment, an experimental design if you like. We pre-tested all the students in the fall to make sure that we had a sense of what they brought to the table. And then we post-tested in the spring using one of the 3 academic tests, the Terra Nova, the Accuplace, or the Work Keys, and then the appropriate occupational test, either from NOCTI, AYES, or from MarkEd. Here's the first thing that we found. Our first level of analysis was to look at all of the CTE students on one side of the equation who got the enhanced treatment, and then compare them to all of the CTE students on the other side who did not. We did this, as in some of the others, in 2 ways. We first looked at the classroom level of analysis, that is, looking at those classrooms, the 15 or 20 experimental compared to the 15 or 20 on the other side. And what we found was that the Terra Nova, or for the Terra Nova and for the Accuplacer, the kids who were in the experimental classes performed significantly better on those tests than did kids in the control classes. Now that was true whether we looked at the classroom level of analysis or if we looked at the student level of analysis. We got roughly the same results. We did not find any effect of work keys, or we did not find any impact on the work keys tests. So looking at all of the kids together, all of the CTE kids who were experimental versus all the CTE kids who were control, we found that in fact, yes, we did have an effect. When we break it out by sites, again, 2 ways. First, looking at classrooms. We found that in 4 of the 5 sites, there were significant effects. We're looking at question 1, remember now, the extent, whether or not we could have an effect. I have to explain site V. The bar there looks very tiny. As it turns out, site V, by just a quirk of randomization, the kids in the experimental classes were scored considerably lower on the math pretest than the kids on the control side. So in fact, they made up that difference, plus they gained a few extra percentage points, so that the change was quite large, although the effect at the end of the study was relatively small. However, that change was indeed significant. In Site X, at the classroom level, in part because there were relatively few classrooms but a lot of students, we didn't see any measurable effect there. But in 4 of the 5 sites, 1 or 2 of the tests proved to be, or the students in the experimental side of the study performed better than students on the control side. We get a little clearer picture when we actually look at the student level of analysis, moving from classrooms where we have few, anywhere from 4 to 10 to as many as 20 to 30, to student level analysis where the models have a little bit more statistical power. And here you see that in every site, on 1 or more of the tests, the students in the experimental classes outperform the students in the control classes. Now, that's the first question. So in conclusion to our first question, yes, it makes a difference if you do this. But the next question is, what's the magnitude of the effect? How much of an impact did we have? One of the ways to get at this question is to look at something called effect size. We used something called Cohen's d, which isn't all that important, but let me explain what it means. One of the ways to think about improving on test scores is to think about how much of a percentile shift one can get out of any particular intervention. So if, for example, your Cohen's d was a 0.8, what that would mean is that the kid in the experimental group, which in this case would be the green line, would score the median score, or the average score there would be at the 79th percentile of the non-treated group. So that would mean we would have the effect of moving that kid from the 50th to the 79th percentile. So that's just one way of thinking about the magnitude of the effect. And here's what we actually found. Again, looking at the all-class level and then by site level. At the all-class level, on the Terra Nova, we had an effect size of 0.28. That meant that on average, we moved that kid from the 50th to the 62nd percentile in that test. The Accuplacer, we moved them, it was more modest. The effect size is 0.11, moving from the 50th to the 56th percentile. But then when we look at our sites, remember now, across the sites we had different kinds of math, different amounts of math, different levels of math. We had effect sizes that ranged, as you can see there, from 0.18 to 0.87, moving kids anywhere from the 58th to the 82nd percentile. In terms of the effect that we were able to achieve, the magnitude of the effect, one can conclude that we were able to move kids quite a ways in terms of their measured math ability. Now, by contrast, and to put this into some context, there's an organization called the Carnegie Learning Corporation, which produces a product called Cognitive Tutor. It's a computer-based program that works with kids, and in this case, this is their Algebra 1 version, that works with kids to help them master, in this case, algebra. Their product in their research has an effect size of 0.22. So you can look at that in relation to what we were able to achieve. And as we come back later with how much time was invested in all of this, this provides a further point of an interesting contrast. Now, one of the questions that came up during the course of the study is the extent to which higher and lower ability students benefited from this. Some of the teachers in our study actually said to us they thought that their lower ability kids were getting more out of it than their higher ability students. So that's a testable question, and so we looked at it. We took our students and separated them based on pretest scores into a top quartile and bottom quartile, and then looked at our results. And what we find is that in both cases, for the Terra Nova and Accuplacer, again, the two tests where we had consistent effects, the upper ability kids actually got more out of the process, or the treatment, if you will, than did the lower ability kids. Now, at first we were a little concerned about this, but as we began to search this out, it turns out that this is a common phenomenon. And in fact, it even has a name. It's called the Matthew effect. Matthew 13:12, if you go to the New Testament. And to paraphrase in the words of Bessie Smith, them that gots, gets. In essence, what it says is that kids who come into high school with higher measured levels of academic ability get more out of the high school experience, gain more on any tests you particularly want to share with them, than kids who come in with lower measured academic ability. So in a sense, our findings are consistent with other literature, but I want to point out here that all of the kids did benefit, whether they were in the upper or lower quartile in terms of measured academic ability. So we did have an effect. There is a differential effect that is consistent with other research. Remember now, our third question has to do with whether or not we were able to do this without having any kind of a negative impact on technical or occupational skill development or occupational knowledge. Our anticipation was, or our null hypothesis, if you will, would be there would be no difference. That is to say, the control and experimental groups would score the same on these occupational or content knowledge tests. And in fact, that's what we found, except in one site. And in one site, we found that the kids in the experimental classes significantly outperformed the kids in the control classes on the occupational or skill test. What this suggests is that, at least in this site, and there's some evidence it's true in the others, that mastering more mathematics has the salutary benefit of also improving your understanding of the underlying occupational content. Another question that we were interested in was how much time the teachers actually spent doing this. And what we found was that, on average, teachers spent about 19 hours over the course of the year working with these math-enhanced lessons. Now, it's important to understand, this is not 19 hours of direct math instruction. This is 19 hours of instruction, of occupational content instruction, that has embedded in it math. So it's not direct math instruction, which, if you do the rough calculations, is perhaps 10% of the class time. If you recall, I mentioned that the cognitive tutor that had an effect size of 0.22, what they will tell you in their reports is that students spend 40% of their time in those classes working with cognitive tutor. We conclude that this is a relatively modest investment in terms of class time for a rather sizable payoff in terms of improved math performance. Now, when we started this study, we really thought that at the end of the day, we would be able to produce what I came to call a box of curriculum, or a binder of lesson plans with perhaps a CD or a DVD with some instruction, and that with a minimum amount of teacher training on a one-to-one basis or in small groups, we could provide these materials and you could go off and replicate and get our results. We learned, however, something quite different. That is, curriculum development is not a box of lesson plans. Rather, it is a process. And it is a process of creation and, to some extent, a process of destruction and followed by creation. Taking apart the curriculum and reconstructing it in new and different ways. It involves building communities of practice, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. And that we think the replicability is not by an individual teacher or even a teacher with a math teacher, or a couple of teachers in a school with a math teacher or two, but rather it's teams of teachers who are really committed to this process, who work together over an extended period of time. And what I'd like to do now is talk more about what we actually learned from what we found. The first principle that we have is we go back to this business of a community of practice. When we organized the study, more as a convenience at that time, quite frankly, we brought teachers together around specific occupational foci. We wanted to control for the curriculum. So the auto teachers worked with the auto teachers, the health teachers worked with the health teachers, and so forth. It turns out that this is a very important part of how to make this work. Recall that the math is different in these different occupational arenas, so that the conversations are necessarily different. This group of teachers might be talking about algebra, this group of teachers might be talking about geometry, this group of teachers might be talking about statistics. What we did find, and you saw from that other graphic, is that there's a little bit of everything everywhere, and that none of this follows a textbook, and none of this necessarily follows a set of math standards, but rather it reflects the real world, where in the real world, which unfortunately does not align with textbooks or standards, but rather that's what's there. That's what we were able to access. And what we found in these communities of practice was that the conversations were incredibly rich. And the reason that we use this phraseology is because what we really found was that you had novices and experts, both within CTE and within math, but also across CTE and across math, in ways that we just never envisioned. So this is a very important part of what we think is necessary, is creating these communities of practice that can come together throughout the course of the academic year and beyond in order to develop the curriculum and then to continue to work together.
In anticipation of this webcast, we asked the site facilitators at two of our sites, Health and Auto Technology, to conduct interviews with the teachers who participated in the study. These teachers came together after the experimental intervention and had a debriefing on the process of participating in the study. We conducted brief interviews in which we asked them about their experiences in the study. We did not ask them about the core principles that Dr. Stone is referring to here, but many of their comments in these interviews spoke directly to these core principles. These were volunteered comments that we're going to be seeing to give a little example from each of these core principles.
Probably the teamwork. I mean, Yeah, I'm sort of the lone. We don't have CIS instructors where I'm at. So I sort of have the opportunity, which is sort of nice. You can develop and change as you need to. Well, now I was working with someone. We were working with a group, trying to see what other people within the state were doing, and trying to find likenesses, and that was tough. It really that probably took us. We spent more time on that and trying to get things in order, and working as a team, and then having that final thing, that final project, and the product that we could all be proud of. I think that was a great thing. You know, I coach, and as a coach, we're always preaching team, and I enjoyed being part of the team. And you know, the hard work wasn't the issue; it was that final product.
I didn't have a lot of exposure to academic teachers prior to this, and now they're my teachers too. You know, the health OC teachers were my teachers before. Now those math teachers are also my teachers. They just may not know it yet. So I really saw a change in both sets of teachers. One of the things that I think happened the most with this project is that I actually saw a mutual respect develop between the health occupations teachers and the math teachers, and I think one that was not there previously. And that mutual respect really bonded them, started a friendship, and enabled them to ask questions of each other they may have been timid to ask of each other prior to the project. There is a necessity not just to pass out lesson plans. That will not work. We've done that in the past. Teachers have to have a vested interest. It's the professional development piece. It's the piece that enables those teachers to work together and to develop those lesson plans and to practice those things. That professional development is critical. And in some way, we need to figure out how to get that piece to the teachers and enable them to really wrap their arms around this project.
Plus, because of the study, we all made new friends that are just a really nice group of people, you know, that on a personal level.
Building on this first core principle of creating communities of practice, we look at the second core principle, which is building from our curriculum mapping discussion earlier. It's absolutely important that we begin with the CTE curriculum. We start there, not with the math curriculum. It's a process where we just build from what is there, what's genuine, what's real. And as I noted earlier, we take those maps and then we lay them out across the year, creating scope and sequences. It's also important that the math be taught when it naturally occurs. This sort of takes away the Math Mondays and the Math on Wednesdays and some of these other things that we sometimes like to do. But teaching the math when it occurs. We actually had a teacher who kind of ran her own quasi-experiment as part of what she was doing. And what you can see here that she told us is to emphasize this importance of teaching the math when it actually occurs. She actually had a chance to teach the same class, but one was enhanced, one was not. And what she found was that the group that got the lesson out of context, if you will, had a much more difficult time with it. Rather than teaching it in context with the second group, she sort of taught it at a different time. And I think this really points up the importance of the importance of teaching the math when it occurs. This means there may be weeks when you're not actually addressing any mathematical concepts in your CTE class. There may be other times where it's very intense. But it occurs when it should occur. And again, this makes it difficult to map it out to other kinds of frameworks. So what I'd like to do is have a couple of teachers share with you their thoughts about this notion of mapping.
What we did at the beginning of the study was do what was called a curriculum mapping. And so we found out what health concepts we had and then related the math concepts to those. And so most of the lessons that were taught were part of my curriculum.
At first she was kind of dubious as to whether or not there was really that much math there. But then when she started looking for it, it was pretty obvious. And she came up with a lot. And she was able to draw in a lot of things that I don't think other people might have seen. She actually was able to pull in quite a bit.
I love the way it actually took the career and technical education health science curriculum and pulled the math out of that, as opposed to taking a math standard and trying to figure out how to push it into the CTE. I think that that emphasis made an entire difference in the way the project ran, and I can hardly wait to see these results.
We had to talk an awful lot about what math really did exist in his program, and we had to remind ourselves over and over again that we weren't just trying to find some math concept that we were going to shove into his program, but that we had to find a math concept that already existed. I needed to learn a little bit about it, and then from there we just kind of went with it, and sometimes we'd kind of go off the track a little bit, but we'd come back, and I certainly learned a whole lot about the auto trade as well.
Building in communities of practice, focusing on the CTE curriculum. The next core principle is recognizing and understanding that math is an essential workplace skill. One of the ways I like to think about this is that if you're a mechanic in a shop, you might reach for a wrench, you might reach for a screwdriver, or you might reach for a math formula. When I taught high school marketing, we taught advertising, we taught selling, I taught statistics because I taught marketing research, and if you're going to be able to do research and interpret it, you have to know something about statistics. It's a tool, and in helping our teachers think about this to help their students understand it, it's one of the mechanisms that I think breaks down the resistance that students often, too often perhaps, have toward learning mathematics. But when they see that it's necessary to make sure that truck is safe, when they see that it's necessary to make sure that you can provide adequate information on that burn victim, then they begin to recognize and understand it, and because they're in the career tech ed as an elective, and presumably they want to be there, this makes them more open to understanding and learning the math. And indeed, we had the teacher teams generate this, as we talked about earlier. One of our techniques in this, as I believe I mentioned a bit earlier, is this notion of the bridging language. We constantly moved back and forth between the math, the language of the workplace and the language of math, so that students would become more comfortable moving from occupational workplace language to thinking about math and solving workplace problems. And again, we have a few teachers we'd like to have you visit with right here.
We're attuned enough to realize that in order for employment, they're going to have the math skills. And they've heard that enough from myself and the integrated teachers that come in for science and communications and math, that at that point in time they were starting to realize this, that I have to know this or I'm not going to be employed.
You always have one or two students that are not really excited about math, and it was kind of a struggle to get them involved, but once they found out how it applied into the health area, the battle was pretty much won, that they're going to need to know this information and use it every day when they worked. Now that we can incorporate the math into our curriculum, it just makes our students stronger. And when they're going into the workforce, they can look at that and go, those students know this information. And to me, I just feel I'm sending them a better student for the employment field.
I was surprised at how much math, the difficulty levels that he really taught. And I think he was surprised, how closely related the math that I teach is to his content area.
They saw a direct correlation between the automotive industry and the academic component, the math component of it. If you want kids to be successful and to learn, you have to get them to buy into whatever you're doing. When you take math and put it into automotive and show practical application of that math in automotive, then the kids start to understand, because now there's something they can put their hands on. I needed Renee to support me mathematically, and I had to have the kids believe in me that what we were doing was real life stuff.
So, in communities of practice, beginning with the CTE curriculum, recognizing that math is a workplace skill. It's not an abstract subject that sits out there that you have to get through in order to get out of high school, but it's something you really need to use in order to be successful in these workplaces. The next core principle that we build on then is the notion of what came to be known as sort of maximum math. And this means several different things. Obviously, we need to build on the students' current level of math understanding. But the effort was, in working with our teachers, was to pull out as much math as they could, but also to recognize that that math pops up at different times throughout the course of the year. Because the math follows the occupational curriculum, it may mean that you have something very complex before this week, and then a week or 2 weeks or a month later you have something that's perhaps in a totally different math area or perhaps more simple. It isn't structured or organized around any math curriculum, but rather it bubbles up. And it's important for teachers to take advantage of those, what we would like to call the teachable moments. So if you're in auto technology, Ohm's law pops up here, it pops up there, it pops up over there. The idea is that every time the opportunity exists, you come back and teach and reteach those concepts because they are essential workplace skills. And again, we have a few teachers who can tell you a little bit about how they saw this.
When they realized after it was all over that they actually were completing math concepts, they saw that this is something that they could do, and so then their perspective of it changed. And I, even in my own classes, some students who were participating in the study said, gee, we did this in our health class, and so it was good. It was something that they felt confident in as a result of working in the program.
Pharmacy deals in a lot of math anyway, so most of the lessons were very easy to just work into the program, so I didn't have any problems with that at all. They call my class a math class anyway because you're constantly calculating dosages and there's a lot of math there anyway, so they didn't have a problem accepting this. I mean, they just took it as part of the curriculum and just moved on through it.
It felt just right to be putting extra math into where I already had to do a little, but now I was doing considerably more. By the middle of the year, they recognized that this actually is life stuff. And by the end of the year, we had a lot of, I get it. Kids who had never gotten math, kids who were petrified of it were saying, this works. I understand this. Even matrices. I had kids say for the first time ever, I understand matrices. Kids who never would have believed that was possible.
He knew the math, and he knew the math that was in his technical area, but he didn't know how necessarily to get it down on paper, and how am I going to present this, and how do I infuse the math at the level that we want it into the lesson. And we were able to work and do that, but then as we got 2 or 3 lessons done and under control, it just seemed like things started to flow and there weren't as many questions.
Our final core principle addresses an important question, and that is, and it's an important point, our effort was to not turn our CTE teachers into math teachers, but rather to help them become better teachers of mathematics, as we might help them become better teachers of marketing research, or better teachers of health, or better teachers of brakes and front-end alignment. If, in fact, math is a workplace tool, then CTE teachers need to understand and be able to access the mathematics that undergirds their particular occupational arena and help their students access it and understand it with the intent of using it to solve workplace skills. But also it has a salutary benefit of helping them do better on more traditional measures of math skill. And so we had teachers participate in professional development. We gave them additional help when necessary in understanding the math, and they were given opportunities to practice the teaching of their math. So again, the 5 core principles address the notion of building communities of practice, of focusing on and beginning with the CTE curriculum, which is part of that is teaching the math when it occurs, recognizing and helping the students understand that math is an essential workplace skill. That in this approach we want them to maximize the math to whatever extent possible. And then finally to recognize that we are not about the process of trying to turn CTE teachers into math teachers, but helping them better understand and deliver a piece of what is career and technical education. One of the questions that we have gotten frequently is, actually before we do that, I want to let you have a chance to visit with some more teachers who also will share their thoughts about this notion.
Since I haven't done much with math, other than the little things that we've always done in our course, that was the biggest stumbling point and the biggest awkward moments where if I got stuck, I found myself having to prepare the night before, and with my math person, we really did a lot of work to bring my comfort level up. And other than that, I mean, the rest of it was smooth. I mean, that was stuff that I was comfortable with, and I blending it together with the math was the difficult part. I have more tools to give. I mean, I wasn't a good math person. I thought I was pretty darn good, but I really wasn't, because I was uncomfortable. And now I think I'm a better teacher. I have more to give, most definitely, as a result of this study. And as a result of it, my kids will get more. So I'm providing a better education, and hopefully the kids will be much more successful in life as a result of this.
As soon as you mention math in an automotive program, they're freaking out. I had to work with Renee to find out how can I make the math, the algebra component that she works with all the time, how can I make that work in my program and not become another math class?
My math partner was just indispensable. She helped us really get started, helped formulate a lot of the sequence to deliver the lessons, and it just without her, I think we would have been lost. I'm not a math teacher. I'm very good at math, but I was never comfortable at teaching it. And initially, when I first started teaching these lessons, I was not comfortable with it, and I didn't realize how hard a job they have. But in teaching the math concepts, it helped me teach the technology better. The kids just understood it. Now that they whatever it was, now that I was introducing a new tool into the curriculum that helped them understand what it was they were supposed to learn, and it really did. It was a double-edged sword in that respect. I think it helped them with their math skills, but it also helped them learn the technology. They're not a lot more intelligent when it comes to the actual technology in the field.
Now let me talk about one of the questions that we are frequently asked, kind of what we are and what we're not. And I've thought about this, and one of the ways I like to explain it is on a continuum of contextualization, if you will. At one end of the continuum, you have your traditional math class, be it Algebra 1 or Geometry or whatever. And there's a way in which math teachers work with kids in terms of math. And it works perfectly well for some kids. A second way that math shows up on this continuum is in what I call the coordinated approach. And this is where, particularly in career academies and in small learning communities, the health teacher and the biology teacher and the math and science teacher work together, and they coordinate around themes so that for the kids they're getting a cohesive, coherent school day. They might be talking about notions of septic and antiseptic, and they look at issues around bacteriology in the science class, and in the health occupations class perhaps they're talking about the importance of just simply washing your hands, and in the history class they might talk about epidemics and so forth. So there's a way to coordinate the thinking about curriculum. And then there's a lot of what we call context-based. And I think some of what is presented as contextual really is more context-based. This is where I think you find the effort to sort of superimpose a math curriculum, be it algebra or geometry, or a set of state standards on top of an occupational area, so that the examples are in the context of, say, carpentry, but they don't necessarily bubble up out of the fact that you're trying to build a wall and make it square. And then finally, there's what we do, which we think is truly contextual, where the context of the occupation, the actual problems the kids are encountering in their classrooms, in their shops, or in their labs, is the basis for the math instruction. Now, in working with this study over the last 2 years, several issues have bubbled up, and I just want to share these with you because these are, at the moment, without answers, but there are things that we need to think about. The first one is what we've come to call the tipping point. What we did worked, and it has benefit for kids, and it took an average of about 10% of the class time in terms of an investment. But how much of this can we do? And there's really two ways to think about this. First of all, in our study, for the most part, we focused on one class out of an entire program. We think that if we could look at, for example, the full 3 or 4 years of agricultural education that many students engage in, we could certainly magnify the impact. If we looked at the 2 years of some auto tech programs instead of just one semester, we could magnify the effect. But the other side of that is how much can we work with teachers before we reach the point where this is no longer a CTE class and in fact is becoming more of a math class. there's a tipping point. There's a point at which we become sort of a different kind of math class rather than a CTE class in which you're learning skills to use a different tool called math in an occupational curriculum. And that is a real issue. And sort of tied into that is this notion of what I've come to call the crisis of immediacy. The problems are real. The problems are now. School administrators, teachers have to solve problems right now. We're in a high-stakes testing environment. Schools need to help young people master mathematics, and they need to do it quickly. However, really, truly helping young people master math, as opposed to just passing a test, takes time. This is not a quick fix. And as I note in the point 2 there, it's neither, nor is it necessarily cheap. This takes some investment in terms of professional development, thinking about professional development in different ways. This is the system investment, which is possibly a barrier. If you only have 3 days or 4 days or 5 days assigned to professional development, our model won't work. I will tell you that right now. The system has to be willing to invest. And then the third issue that has bubbled up, and is another one that's very important, is the question of whether or not we should provide math credit for career and technical education where the math has been enhanced. We don't have an answer for that. We understand the tension that is out there. We understand the pressure that is out there to do this. However, there are some issues. The first of which, of course, is the extent to which the CTE teacher would be considered highly qualified to deliver on a math content. Now, I know there's some states that have sort of worked around this problem and think they might have an answer, and perhaps it is a good answer. But the bigger problem that I'm concerned about, and that others have expressed concern about, is that if you say that we're going to give math credit, at what point, again, back to the tipping point question, at what point are we no longer a career technical education class, but an alternative delivery for math skills? And I see in that the potential loss of CTE integrity. So these are issues, and at the moment, as issues, they are without resolution and need to be thought about a lot more. So what do we conclude? What we conclude is very simply, in a mathematical formulation, that it is both process and the pedagogy working together that give us the math achievement built on these core principles that I've talked about. And if we think about necessary ingredients, again, we think it's absolutely vital that we build these communities of practice around specific occupational foci or specific CTE content. I don't think you can mix across family and consumer science and auto technology or health because the math is different, the curriculum is different, and the conversations are necessarily different. It absolutely requires administrator support. We think these approaches probably will work best if we look at them from a state level. Partly to get a sufficient critical mass to create these communities of practice, those 10 to 20 teams that we think are minimal for this to happen. We also think state support's necessary to provide the kind of financial support to provide time for teachers, the substitute pay, the cost for professional development and so forth, the facilities. We think that will require state intervention and probably would be more efficient that way. We also think that we have to staff the structure. And what I mean by that is in our approach to doing this, we have an organizational structure, if you will, that if time permits, I can get into more detail. And then finally, we think it's absolutely vital that you document. That means pre-testing and post-testing. That means careful monitoring of what you're doing, how you're doing it, so that at the end, if indeed you find that there is an increase in math skill on the part of the CTE students, you're able to better explain how you got that, because in this era of accountability, I have absolutely no doubt that at some point someone's going to say, well, how do you know that wouldn't have happened anyway? And so the documentation is absolutely vital. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. I want to now turn this back over to Morgan, who has a few closing comments, and then I think we still have some time for questions.
The last clip we want to show you underscores the critical resource which Jim referred to in that last slide. It's time for CTE and math instructors to work together to interrogate the curriculum and to develop the lessons. And this, once again, was a volunteered comment. The question was not planted.
Love the fact that whenever we're writing lessons, we have time that's not interrupted by outside influences. We can just say, okay, we're going to write this lesson, and if it takes 2 hours, great. If it takes 4 hours, that's okay too, because we know what we want to get accomplished. We start it, and we just keep going until it's done. And it's been great to have that willingness of all the people. Just, this was the first time that I think I've ever seen professional development done the right way. Oftentimes when you do professional development, there's this, okay, we're going to talk at you for 6 hours, we're going to hand you a bunch of handouts, now you go home and do all the real work. This was the first time that in 15 years that I've ever had someone say, okay, we're going to talk at you for a while, then you're going to work, you're going to come back, you're going to talk to each other. There was really enough time to really create a lesson from beginning to end and then try it out, fix it if we needed to, move on to a different lesson, and so on and so forth. It was fabulous.
Well, thank you once again, Jim, for a most interesting presentation. The study addressed what many consider the critical issue facing secondary vocational education, whether it can truly have a positive impact on academic skills. You conducted a sound study which yielded firm evidence that in teaching within an occupational context can increase those scores without having any detriment to the learning of the technical skills. Now I'd like to turn to some of the questions that have come in. We give those who visit our website the opportunity to submit questions even prior to the webcast, and I'm going to ask those questions which came in prior to the webcast first. I teach nursing in a community college with many disadvantaged youth. As a faculty, we are finding students failing math calculations for dosage of medication. Would your experimental interventions for math apply to nursing and help our students?
Well, the short answer is yes. And the idea that nursing students are failing in calculating proper doses makes me really nervous. I'm counting on those nursing types to be there when I need them, which is not far from now. One of our replications was in health occupations, and it did deal with that very specifically. So it clearly has application.
As a community college Perkins coordinator, I can only put funds towards career and technical education courses, not general education courses. So how might I help with the math issue from this end?
Well, again, I think what we chose to do purposefully in our study was to build on the existing career tech ed courses that presumably are applicants of Perkins funding. Involving math teachers in this, and again, you'd have to check with those who monitor that. I don't think that presents any problem in supporting that with Perkins funding. But we did ground all of this in career and technical education coursework. So I don't see that that would be a problem.
No, certainly money for professional development. Mm-hmm. You know. How do I obtain information on the study for a dissertation?
Well, come to the University of Minnesota, sign up, and we'll charge you a lot of money. Well, we have the pilot report is presently on the website, so you can go to nccte.org. Under publications, 2004, I believe, you'll see that the pilot study is there. For you dissertators, the lit review is pretty good. The methodology is spelled out there. The final report we have out for external review. We're beginning to receive some feedback. I expect that'll be completed in the next month or so. So that'll be accessible as well.
Were you able to distinguish the students' math achievement at basic levels, for example, matching 8th grade standards versus more advanced levels, for example, matching high school standards?
We began not with standards. Let me see, I hope I understand the question. Again, our model is built on the idea that we're going to access the math that's there. We used high school normed tests. We had a college placement test. The Terra Nova was normed for, I believe it was 11th and 12th grade. The WorkKeys has a single math test. So these were clearly measures of high school level math skills. The extent to which we linked them to standards was individual to the states. The individuals in those states chose to show which standards they linked to, but again, the standards didn't drive the choice of the math. The occupation drove the choice of the math that we focused on.
Are there future plans to continue this study? If so, what?
Yes. There are a number of other questions that flow from this. One of the questions that comes up frequently is, well, can you do this in science or literacy skills? And we think the model would work there as well. But remember the tipping point issue. Although I think we could do more math, perhaps, certainly science and possibly literacy skills, at what point are we no longer a CTE class but an alternative delivery system for some set of academics? That's an issue. However, having said that, we are hoping to move this into other areas that we weren't able to tap into with this study. For example, family and consumer science, especially in the middle and early high school grades, also offers rich opportunities for working with young people to master mathematical skills that they probably learned in elementary or middle schools, but have either forgotten or really don't know how to use to solve everyday and indeed workplace problems. There are other areas like the construction and trades area, machine tools and such that we think are rich in mathematics that we weren't able to access. We think that our selection of those 5 sort of represents the breadth of career and technical education, but there are specific areas that we'd like to focus on. Another aspect of our study that I didn't talk too much about is that the teachers who worked with us were volunteers. We recruited teachers across the United States and said, sign up, and if you sign up, we'll randomly assign you. It's safe to assume that teachers who volunteer for something like this are different from teachers who do not. One of the next studies we hope to do is to look more broadly at sort of the broad range of teachers who might be out there in career and technical education, the volunteer kind and the non-volunteer kind, to see if we would get the same sort of effects when teachers maybe aren't quite so interested in showing up for these kinds of things. That, I think, is a very important question. We are very interested in the extent to which this model can be built into pre-service education. These were teachers, many of whom had years and years of experience that we worked with. But what would happen if we really tried to work in the collegiate teacher education, teacher preparation programs, and what sort of barriers might we face in trying to work across the disciplines at that level? We had tremendous support and buy-in from math teachers in the schools. But would we get the same sort of buy-in and support from professors of math education, for example, at a university in a teacher preparation program? We think that's an important question, and it's certainly a researchable question. A couple of the first questions came from community colleges. Does this model work as well in community college or tech college or post-high school programs? That's another kind of question that we think could be explored. We have quite a few questions we'd like to push on as a result of this. Again, I want to emphasize that what we found was, I think, quite powerful and quite sizable for a relatively modest investment of time. There are parameters that we'd like to push on to see to what extent we're able to continue and build and amplify and create even more value for career and technical education as part of the American high school experience.
Your previous answer anticipated the answer to this question, but I'll read it anyway. Do you know of similar studies with regard to the integration of science into CTE?
I'm not aware of any of this kind. I know that a lot of teachers independently and working in teams within schools and school districts have done work. I've seen some presented at conferences, but in terms of testing a theoretical model, I'm not aware of any, and if anybody knows of any, I'd be very happy to hear about it.
And another, applying to another area, where can I find information on adult basic education mathematics interventions?
I don't know. I have a colleague, Professor Rosemary Park at the University of Minnesota, who's worked with the center on a number of projects, who would be an excellent contact. My other suggestion is Google adult basic education math skills or something like that, and I think you would find a tremendous resource. It's not an area that we have looked at in these studies.
And this final question is relates to something I know you have some plans for. Will curriculum examples be a part of the final report?
We will make everything that we've developed accessible on our website, but I need to explain, it's going to take a little time, and here's why. The first part of our reporting is the scientific report, the technical report, if you will. As I mentioned, that's out for review right now. We're getting feedback on that. And once we have that polished and ready to go, that'll be out on the website. We are working right now with the different lesson plans, and I'm trying to remember, Morgan, do you remember how many in total we have?
It's around 120, I think.
Right. We have over 100 lesson plans across these 5 curricular areas. Before we can sort of release those to the public, we want to make sure that everything's correct. From spelling to, we want to make sure the math is correct, make sure everything's solidly grounded. We certainly don't want to put anything out there that has errors in it. So we're in the process now of reviewing that. I hope that within the next 3 months or so, we will have the curriculum maps, we'll have the scope and sequences, we'll have the lesson plans, and all of the other materials we develop. Those will be accessible. But I do want to emphasize that we absolutely believe, and in fact, one of the teachers made the same observation, that having these in your possession will not necessarily give you the results that we got. If you simply take those and try to implement them, we think that the pedagogy which is reflected in those materials is vital. But also the process of professional development, the way in which these communities of professional practice were developed, the way they were nurtured, the way we interacted with them. There are more elements to this study that time hasn't given us, we don't have time to talk about. But there's that piece of it. We think both are absolutely necessary. One or the other isn't going to do it. But again, the materials will be accessible. And again, our time frame, I hope, we're working on it, is within about the next 3 months or so.
Well, thank you again, Jim. And the National Dissemination Center is working to develop other webcasts which will go into more depth on the actual lessons which were used as part of the study and also the professional development process. Final plans of those have not been completed, but we will have those prepared for preparation, we hope, early in 2006. Thank you, Jim. As you mentioned, I was a member of the staff on this project. And in some 40 years of studying career and technical education, it was a very rewarding experience. Working with the dedicated teachers and the site facilitators, I found very reaffirming of my belief in public education. Thank you for joining us today. This is the final webcast for 2005. I almost said 19-something. 2005 shows my 40 years of experience. And we do both of the national centers, the staff at the National Research Center, National Dissemination Center, wish you and yours the happiest of holiday seasons. Please check back on our website for future webcasts that will be broadcast in 2006. Thank you again.